Thank you very much, Dr. Pocock, for making the time at the end of your busy work day to join us from across the Atlantic. Many of you probably have seen Dr. Pocock's work, but I'll just say a few words to introduce him. He's a professor of medical statistics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which, like he just mentioned, is essentially the London School of Public Health. And he is very well known for his work in clinical trials, both as regards methodological developments as well as his collaborations in major clinical trials, particularly in cardiology. And his interests include diverse topics in this area, standards for statistical reporting of trials and epidemiological studies, statistical, ethical, and organizational principles for data monitoring, including early stopping guidelines, the win ratio, which is what he's going to speak to us about today, which concerns composite outcomes, which, as we all know, are popular in cardiovascular clinical trials, adaptive designs, and so on. I don't want to take up his time, so I'm going to just pass it over to him. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you. And I gather it's an unusual time for these seminars for you, but it's a civilized time for me, being just 5 p.m. here rather than the middle of the night. So thank you for adapting your timing for me. I'm going to talk about the win ratio, which was a new approach developed. I helped to develop it about 12 years ago for the analysis of composite endpoints based on clinical priorities. And then I've now inserted the word developing into the title because all sorts of increased use has happened over the last few years, and therefore it seems appropriate to give an update on how it's going. So next slide, please. Many of my examples relate to heart failure, patients with chronic heart failure. And you have a problem of choosing in a randomized trial, comparing new drugs or perhaps devices as well. What are the endpoints that really matter to you? Of course, the ultimate is mortality, and there you may concentrate on cardiovascular deaths. Also relevant are clinical events, such as heart failure hospitalizations. But then in early phase trials, they will take more interest also in quality of life, changes in a very popular Kansas City cardiac questionnaire, is KCCQ for short, is commonly used in evaluating the quality of life of heart failure patients. Has been the standard really these days. Or you may look at blood biomarkers such as change in NT-proBNP, and you could also look at other second surrogate endpoints such as changes in 6-minute walk tests. And trials, early phase trials, will concentrate more on those at the bottom of the list. But if you really want your new drug or device approved for general use, you need to go up towards the clinical events and the deaths. You'd like to choose death as an outcome because it's the ultimate one that matters most, but you'd often be underpowered if you did that, because fortunately most patients do not die. And therefore the conventional primary composite endpoint that they've used over and over again is the time to first heart failure hospitalization or cardiovascular death, whichever happens first. So next slide, please. Oh, by the way, I thought we agreed that we'd take questions at the end for a Zoom talk, because it's quite difficult to take questioning as we go along. My normal style, if I was only in the room with you, which I'd love to be, would be to take questions all the time. But I'll just keep going to the end, and then we'll have a question session at the end. Okay. Take an example of one trial I was recently involved in. It's called the Emperor Preserved trial. You'll gather that cardiovascular clinical trials love to have fancy acronyms, and this one is Emperor. There's an Emperor reduced ejection fraction trial too. And this is the sort of typical positive result that you're hoping to get from such a trial. The primary outcome is indeed heart failure hospitalization or cardiovascular death, whichever happens first. And you see the cumulative incidence of that outcome over time. the Kaplan-Meier plot being the most popular plot in randomized trials studying events. And you can see a nice divergence between the active drug empagliflozin and the placebo. And everyone went away happy in this trial because the hazard ratio for this primary endpoint was 0.79, and the p-value was a healthy p less than 0.001 with a tight confidence interval. So you could say all is good, but what have you missed out on by this standard primary analysis? So the next slide, please. Here we show the details, breaking it down by the components. So we have empagliflozin and placebo, nearly 3,000 patients in each group. And just giving you the numbers of events, you see the primary composite was 415 versus 511. Isn't it nice that if you just did the ratio of those two numbers and didn't even heard of Cox modeling, you'd have got the right answer, which is a ratio of about 0.79. It just shows looking at the numbers could be terribly helpful rather than more complex analyses. But then you split it down by heart failure hospitalizations and cardiovascular deaths. And you'll see that the sum of the two, look at the empagliflozin group, 259 plus 219 is bigger than primary composite because some patients had both. So they had a heart failure hospitalization followed by a cardiovascular death, which means those cardiovascular deaths never featured in the primary analysis because they happened after a hospitalization. And that seems you're missing some relevant information somehow. And the other thing is the total heart failure hospitalizations, including repeats, also goes up quite a lot by almost another 50% or more here in this case, with a good length of follow-up. And those are not included in the primary analysis either. So problems with the conventional composite primary, as you can see at the last two lines here, it ignores 32% of cardiovascular deaths in the analysis because they occurred after a relevant hospitalization. And it ignores 36% of all hospitalizations because they were repeats. And people have gone to great lengths to look at ways of bringing those two features into the analysis. So next slide, please. This is a little bit repetitive of what I've just said via the example, so I'll go on to the next slide. So a simplified example is what's going on if you plot two patients, A and B. Patient A, diamonds are hospitalizations, the black circles are death, and you can see that patient A would be said to have done worse because they had the heart failure hospitalization early, relatively early. The fact that patient B died later on in follow-up is sort of labeled, well, one of those things. A did worse than B according to the conventional analysis. And hierarchical outcomes, giving more priority to deaths, is a way we'd like to go with this kind of data instead. So next slide, please. So the win ratio was an alternative approach to composite outcomes, taking account of clinical priorities. By the way, I'd be happy for my slides to be made available to people, Susan, if there's a way of doing that at the end, that would be just fine.
Okay, I'll make a note.
Because people scribbling down references probably don't stand a chance. It already existed as a methodology created by two Harvard statisticians, Diane Finkelstein and David Schoenfeld, and they published a paper on their test of the same principle in Statistics in Medicine in 1999. And I came into this methodology because I came across a trial in valve disease, where it was a trial called PARTNER, the first of what was called the PARTNER trials, and it tried transaortic valve replacement versus standard of care. And they were looking at deaths and at hospitalizations, and they wanted to give the deaths higher priority, hence the methodology I'm about to introduce. But I thought it was odd when I first met it. I didn't like it because it was only a test. There was no estimation principle behind it. And therefore I went away, having seen this trial and its use, and we created as a team at the School of Hygiene the win ratio method. By the way, I get a bit frustrated trying to publish in statistical journals. Lots of picky referees pick on things that I don't like. So I published in the European Heart Journal, and they kindly accepted it in 2012. Lots of water's gone under the bridge, so we published a practical guidance of how's it going in this methodology in the same journal in 2020, and other authors have also been flowing, but there's my main introduction on the references. Next slide, please. So let's go for it, the win ratio in an unmatched approach. What you do is create a hierarchy of outcomes based on their clinical priorities. And if you have two treatment groups, an active new treatment group and a control group, you compare every patient in the active group with every patient in the control group. And suppose there are two levels of outcome of interest, death and hospitalization. For each pair of patients, who won on level 1, death? That's the first question. If neither patient won on death because during their shared follow-up time, neither of them had died, then you move on to who won on level 2, hospitalization. And the winner is, of course, the loser is the one who got hospitalized first. And if neither, then it's a tie for that particular pair of patients. So across all pairs of patients, active patient versus control patient, the win ratio of the number of wins on active divided by the number of wins on control. That's what it is. And you can calculate a confidence interval for it and also a p-value for it, which is essentially the Finkelstein-Schoenfeld test. Next slide, please. Let's work out these winners and losers as to how it works. A conceptual diagram of various pairs of patients, A and B. If patient B dies, you only look at the shared follow-up time, by the way. So if one patient drops out early, then you only compare the patients during that follow-up time that they shared. So the first example shows an early death on B, and therefore that one was the loser. The next example, patient A had a hospitalization first, but in fact B died first during the shared follow-on time, and therefore B is the loser, A is the winner. If both patients died, then it's the one who died first is the loser. If there were no deaths to untie on in that sense, you move on to who won on hospitalizations in a similar manner. The second of those in the middle shows patient A had a hospitalization and then died, but the death is beyond the follow-up time of patient B, and therefore it doesn't count because you never know whether B would have died before then or not. And therefore A is the winner because B had already had a hospitalization, etc., etc. So I hope you get the idea of how it works. Next slide, please. So back to the example I showed earlier, the simplified first patient. I showed that patient A, under the old methodology of a composite, would have been deemed to have been done worse. But in this setting, given patient B had a death during what was the shared follow-up time, then that patient B is declared the loser, even though A got hospitalized first. So the win ratio analysis is changing the order of assessment of things in an appropriate manner. Next slide, please. So let's go to the rest of my talk is very much built around examples illustrating this methodology. This is a device trial called COAPT, published in the New England Journal in 2018. And it was patients with heart failure with moderate to severe mitral regurgitation. And they were randomized to a MitraClip device, 302 patients, and control, slightly more by chance, 312. And at the time of this first publication, which was aimed at 2-year follow-up for the majority, some patients had not been followed for much more than 12 months. So the follow-up was for anything from 12 to 24 months. Any follow-up data beyond 24 months, they actually did not include in that first analysis, even though they had it. The win ratio analysis was secondary and was for the composite of cardiovascular death or first heart failure hospitalization. So let me take you through how that worked out. Next slide, please. This, I find, is the most useful diagram for displaying what the win ratio is doing. So for the device arm, you have 302 patients. The control arm, you have 312 patients. Therefore, the number of patient pairs that you're going to do a comparison device versus control is 302 times 312. So you actually have 94,224 patient pairs to look at. The wins and losses first for deaths. So of those 94,000 pairs, a death occurred first on the control arm, in which case the device arm was the winner in 27,000 cases, whereas the number where the device arm patient died first, the number of pairs was 18,000. In the middle, you have 48,000 who tied on death, meaning probably both patients lived on their shared follow-up time, in which case you then move on to the second level, which is heart failure hospitalizations. There, we found more wins and losses, more wins on the device arm than there were on the control arm. So 15,000 or so versus 7,000 or so. So I'm putting the wins on the device arm in green and the losses on the control arm in red. And the ties are left with 23,000 where you couldn't untie them on the basis of hospitalizations or deaths, because probably they had a clean bill of health, both patients in those pairs, neither event happened. So the win ratio is the total wins divided by the total losses. There are 42,000 odd divided by 26,000 odd, by adding up the greens and dividing them by the reds, gives you a win ratio of 1.61. 95% confidence interval is fairly tight, 1.29 to 2.04, and the p-value from the Finkelstein-Schoenfeld test is p less than 0.301. And this shows overwhelmingly in favor of the MitraClip device. People ask, what does the win ratio mean? It is, as I put in the top right of the slide here, for a random pair of patients, the win ratio is the odds that the better outcome occurred in the treated patients, in those where they were not tied. So looking at those where there was not a tie, the odds that the new treatment did better is 1.61, and that's what the win ratio means. Next slide, please. Moving on to a second well-recognized example was a trial called ATTRACT. And this was again in the New England Journal. And this time they adopted the win ratio analysis as their primary analysis of the trial results. It was a drug called tafamidis in a relatively rare condition called transthyretin amyloid cardiomyopathy. And hence the trial is relatively small, 441 patients, randomized in a 2:1:2 ratio to high-dose tafamidis, lower-dose tafamidis versus placebo. And the follow-up was for 30 months. And the primary hierarchical analysis, they were going to look at all-cause death and then look at, if there were ties, then look at the number of cardiovascular hospitalizations. And for this primary first publications, they combined both doses of tafamidis versus placebo. So next slide, please. In a build-up to what the primary results were, I'll look at the secondary results first. And you can see for deaths, which was a key secondary outcome, they thought they would be underpowered to look at deaths alone, but in fact they just about got there with a hazard ratio of 0.70 and a p-value just below 0.05, because the percentage of deaths was lower on tafamidis. Looking at time to first cardiovascular hospitalization, the hazard ratio wasn't quite significant, may have been hampered by the fact that this analysis was crude and was not taking into account the competing risk of death. If instead you looked at all cardiovascular hospitalizations, including repeats, the rate of such events was rather lower in the tafamidis group. So a rate ratio for incidence of cardiovascular hospitalizations, including repeats, was 0.71. To do this, they were doing a negative binomial model, they were assuming that the rate of hospitalizations for any individual patient was fairly constant, was Poisson, but there was a heterogeneity in those rates, as there always is between patients, and therefore the negative binomial distribution allows for that fact. And so, but again, that analysis did not correct for the competing risk of deaths, and therefore could be argued it's slightly flawed. So let's move on to the main event of this trial. Next slide, please, which is the win ratio method. Now, they said patients need to be stratified by their transthyretin gene TTR status variants or wild type, and also stratified by their general health, what's called their NYHA class 1 or 2 being healthier than class 3 at the time of randomization. And so within each stratum, now it's a stratified win ratio analysis. Within each stratum, you compare every tafamidis patient with every placebo patient to see who won. One, who died first, they lose. If neither patient died, then who had the most cardiovascular hospitalizations during the shared follow-up time, and they lose. So it was quite a complex analysis because now you're stratifying by 4 patient types, 2x2 table there. And you're doing all paired comparisons within each type of patient, which means you end up looking at 17,203 patient pairs. More pairs won on tafamidis than lost, 8595 versus 5071. So the win ratio is 1.70 with a nice p-value of 0.306. So the win ratio analysis helped to accentuate the signals you were separately seeing for deaths and for hospitalizations by combining them into one overall picture. Next slide, please. This shows in a slightly complex way, because you now have 4 strata, how you can display what's going on with the wins and losses. Within each of the 4 strata, and on this grid here, you can see the wins and the losses occurring amongst deaths and for heart failure, cardiovascular hospitalizations, and you add them all up to get the overall result. And so that was not in the original publication, was produced in a sequel article that I published in JACC, the Journal of American College of Cardiology. Next slide, please. So this was kind of a success story. Combining deaths and cardiovascular hospitalization strengthened the evidence in the ATTRACT trial. They had lots of other improvements which don't relate to my methodology. 6-minute walk tests and quality of life were also improved. And so overwhelming evidence for this treatment's effectiveness. And so it was a major breakthrough for what was previously a largely undiagnosed condition, because there wasn't much point in diagnosing it because you didn't have a treatment for it, and now we do. So it's a good story to reveal on top of any methodology we may have used. Okay, next slide, please. I'll go back now to a trial called endpoints, published in the last 12 months in a journal Nature Medicine. And it was the same drug I first introduced in my first example, empagliflozin versus placebo, in acute heart failure patients. Relatively small trial by the standards of heart failure, because 530 outcomes. And the primary outcome was 530 patients, I meant to say. The primary outcome was a hierarchical composite of the following. All-cause death, top of the list, as it should be. The number of heart failure events occurring, they had a definition for events, but I won't get bogged down in what that was at this point. And if the number of heart failure events was the same for any pair of patients, then it's the time to the first heart failure event instead. And if patients were tied on all three of those, then you untied any pair of patients based on their KCCQ total symptom score, the quality of life score overall. And that was measured at 90 days after randomization, and also, of course, at baseline. And for each patient, you looked at the difference between baseline and 90 days. So you calculated that, and then you wanted any pair of patients. That change had to be at least 5 points better on one patient to be declared a win over the other patient. So if you only had a 1 point difference, then that was too tiny to matter. They said we wanted a 5 point difference. And that was, again, using the win ratio method. So let's look at the results. Next slide, please. And it worked out like this. Now, this is new because we're now introducing quality of life on top of events. So there were 265 patients in each treatment group. So you're doing paired comparisons, 265 times 265. By the way, the methodology takes into account the lack of independence of those pairings, the fact that you're using the same patients multiple times. That's all, if you are wondering, that's all taken account of in the methodology. And then we look at time to death, and we can see green for empagliflozin, orangey red for placebo wins, and you can see there were more wins on EMPA than on placebo. The follow-up time was only 90 days, even though the patients were really quite sick with acute heart failure. Obviously, there were not huge numbers of deaths. So the vast majority of patients were tied 88.8% for the death analysis. So you move next to the number of heart failure events, and you can see that the number of heart failure events over 90 days tended to more winners on EMPA. EMPA patients were tending to have fewer heart failure events, 10.9% versus 7.7%, heading in the same direction. And you're beginning to reduce the number of ties down to 70%. The third level was time to first heart failure event, but that only kicks in if a pair of patients had already had the same number of events, say 1. And therefore, that wasn't used very often. And it was really an irrelevance. And so if I was redesigning that trial, I'd said either have time to first event or number of heart failure events in your hierarchy, but don't have both. Probably the number of heart failure events may be a better choice, but it's debatable. But don't do both in the same analysis, because the second one becomes, as you can see in that third line, of green, blue, red, it's pretty well irrelevant. It's not making much difference. Then you move to the fourth step, and this was very helpful because the changes in KCCQ total symptom score tended to be better in the empagliflozin patients. And therefore, you can see there were more wins on EMPA than there were on placebo. In fact, when you compare the green percentages across the different outcomes, you can see that the great untying of patients was mainly being done on the quality of life score. You add all that up and you get an overall percentage of wins on EMPA, percentage of wins on placebo. You could have done it as number, but I've done it as percentages here. And you can see the win ratio was 1.38. And the p-value was 0.003 as a result. So again, we were able, unusually in the clinical trials literature, to combine deaths, events, and changes in quality of life into one overall analysis. And that's why I'm dwelling on this trial, because this was a step forward into how trials might need to go by not relying only on events, but taking patient-reported outcomes into account as well. By the way, as a little aside, there were missing data on the quality of life scores. There's always missing data on something. And therefore, this trial had quite a complex multiple imputation algorithm to generate complete data sets for by imputing missing KCCQ scores for patients. And once you do multiple imputation, then it means your win ratio analysis has to be done multiple times. So these are actually averages of multiple analyses, all based on multiple imputations. And so that's an aside just to take into account. Next slide, please. Now, there's always a complexity. The extra complexity here on top of missing data was that the win ratio analysis for the primary analysis was stratified. They had two types of patients which they thought differed. There were those with acute de novo heart failure and those with decompensated chronic heart failure. And they split them into two separate groups. So they did a win ratio analysis for each of them, came up with win ratios of 1.29 and 1.39 respectively. So the overall stratified analysis was more complicated. The software to do this stuff, but therefore the win ratio in the stratified analysis was slightly lower, 1.36, it so happened, but very similar to the crude unstratified analysis that I showed on the previous slide. And there's a debate as to whether you need to stratify or not when doing win ratio type of analyses. Next slide, please. So here we are looking at trials that are combining clinical outcomes, deaths and hospitalizations, with quality of life measures. The Impulse trial, for instance, if it only used death and heart failure events, it would have not reached a significant conclusion. It was too small to be powered to demonstrate efficacy on events alone, and therefore only by introducing quality of life could it boost power and reach a clear conclusion. It's probably better than ignoring the events and going straight to quality of life as a sole outcome, because then you have the complication of the competing risk of death. This extension of this methodology of quality of life measures is likely to be particularly useful in device trials. Drug trials can be made large. It's relatively easy, providing the disease is common enough, to do a large drug trial. But device trials, by the very process of doing devices, perhaps difficulties of getting suitable controls, sham controls, by the way, are coming more popular, but not easy to do. And therefore, this methodology may be particularly relevant to device trials. Next slide, please. An example of a drug trial looking at quality of life is a trial called DELIVER. And this was in preserved ejection fraction heart failure. So the same patient population broadly as the Emperor Preserved trial, which I showed in my very first example in slide 2 or 3 back at the start of my talk. As a secondary issue, they wanted to look at changes in quality of life, the KCCQ total symptom score, say at 8 months, which was a predefined primary time point. The drug dapagliflozin versus placebo, you can easily show that there was a mean difference in KCCQ when it was measured of 2.4, and that's very, very highly significant. But there's a flaw in that analysis, which is it can only be done in the survivors. And so it's a rather artificial construct. We look at quality of life only in survivors, which of course is not really randomization based anymore. So as an additional analysis, they did a win ratio analysis, taking deaths into account. And to do this, they ranked the KCCQ changes in individual patients at 8 months, from the best change, the aggressive improvement, to the worst. And at the bottom, they then put all the deaths as the worst possible outcome. I suppose it's obvious that the worst possible quality of life outcome is to be dead. And that's literally what the analysis does. They then showed that the win ratio analysis can be done, produces a modest win ratio of 1.11, and the p-value is now not quite as extreme as it was for 0.009. Why is that? It's because the drug, dapagliflozin, like empagliflozin, doesn't have an enormous influence on deaths. So when you're studying quality of life, but then you take deaths into account, you will moderate the strength of evidence appropriately, really. And there's another reference there for how to do this kind of thing for a non-normal outcome, such as this ranking of KCCQ. The next slide, please. There is also a tendency to look at clinical and quantitative outcomes, like a 6-minute walk test, and to do both clinical and quantitative outcomes. And you can do that with a win ratio approach. These become more difficult to interpret if the clinical outcomes, the deaths, and say the hospitalizations, go in an opposite direction to the quantitative outcome, which might be quality of life or a biomarker or a treadmill test score. So the ideal use of the win ratio is when they all go in the same direction, as my examples so far have. Next slide, please. To show people are extending the hierarchies, this is a trial called FROST-HF. It's an atrial flow regulator versus a sham control in heart failure patients. Around 600 patients in a 2-to-1 randomization with 12 to 24 months follow-up. And they've somewhat extended the concept of a hierarchical composite outcome here. Top of the list is cardiovascular death. Next is heart failure, transplant, or an LVAD, which is pretty bad condition if you need those. And then below that, they then have the hospitalizations and the treatment intensifications for heart failure. And below that, the 5th level, they have the quality of life score at 6 months. So here you can see they're getting quite keen on the clinical hierarchy. And this is with 5 levels. I've seen others with 7 or 8 levels. There's no principle against extending the hierarchy as long as it's not a statistical matter. It's easy to do statistically. The matter is, does the hierarchy of outcomes make good clinical sense? So it's an important dialogue between the cardiologists, statisticians, and sponsors in working out what is good clinical sense to then apply the win ratio methodology. Next slide, please. Another example is an unusual one. It's called the SOS-AMI trial. And it's an unusual trial in that it's for patients who've just had a heart attack. So soon after that, you want to study whether you could have a treatment would help if they are developing new symptoms suggestive of a new infarct. So many, many thousands of patients, like 20,000 patients, will be given something to inject, either the active drug selatogrel or placebo. And then you're waiting for the patients to feel they're getting symptoms of a new myocardial infarction, having had one already. And then we're planning that 4,680 such patients will self-inject with the new drug or placebo. It's a very acute trial, short-term outcomes, and we have an ordinal hierarchy. Top of the list is death within 7 days, and we work our way down to a severe acute MI, STEMI, NSTEMI, and so on. And this is a ranking You would have thought you could do a trend test on these data because it would be like a 6x2 chi-squared table, 2x6 table, 2 treatments, 6 outcomes. The FDA didn't like that kind of common odds ratio analysis, and it was the FDA who actually recommended to do a win ratio analysis instead, based on the first 5 of those outcomes there. Next slide, please. So the sort of methodology I've taken you through, what are the disadvantages of it? Well, there's practical difficulties. Designing your trial, how many patients do you need? Power calculations are a bit more complex and you need simulation. And we've described some of the software to do that in our more recent paper. The analysis is less straightforward, but again, more software is becoming available to do it. I've tried to clarify what it means, but it's still at the moment harder to understand than, say, a conventional hazard ratio in a conventional time to event analysis. Power may suffer if death is given a higher priority, but there's no effect on death, then you'll be diluting the ability to see treatment differences. On the other hand, regulators say looking at mortality is terribly important, and exclusion of any mortality signal would be a wrong thing to do. The last slide, please. So conclusions. The win ratio approach is a useful new way to analyze composite endpoints. It recognizes that compounded outcomes are of different clinical importance and hence places them in a hierarchy for analysis. Though initially used for clinical events, it's now been extended to also look at visit-related outcomes such as quality of life. It's getting accepted by regulators. The FDA seem particularly favorable to its use, particularly in device trials, and is getting increasingly used. I get an inquiry about once a week about someone who's thinking of using it. Familiarity, therefore, with how it works is growing, and statistical software is now readily available for use. There are other things I could have said, but I hope that gives a flavor of what it's all about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pocock. That was a very interesting talk, and I like the emphasis on examples illustrating how to actually use this win ratio in so many different situations. I'm going to first request the audience for questions. So I have some questions of my own. Kaveri, I'll let you speak up.
Too quick off the mark. Thank you for a wonderful talk that even a physician epidemiologist can understand, because sometimes our biostatistical talks are extremely complex, so this is very relatable. I had a couple of questions, but I guess one related to one of the last points about the power of the studies using this analysis. I would think that including death as the first outcome in the hierarchy shouldn't be a problem, should it? Because even if whether or not people die, you have a next level, and so you have an opportunity to look at your other outcomes. So wouldn't it by nature potentially increase the power you have for a given sample size?
It depends. First, thanks for your kind remarks. My goal is to communicate to you. Never mind all these statisticians. They will, they like their formulae, and they may have been disappointed by my talk. I love communicating with people like you. So it's two-way traffic here, what we're trying to do. You may or may not lose power, because if you really think there's no effect on mortality, then and it's a fairly lethal condition with a fairly high death rate, then you may lose power by using the win ratio methodology. For instance, you can see many of my examples only use cardiovascular deaths because they thought that there may be an effect on cardiovascular deaths. Whereas if you put in all-cause deaths, maybe the non-cardiovascular, there would be no signal and you would have lost power as a result. So It depends, but gaining power is not the only purpose in life. Gaining insight is also matters, and therefore I don't think power is the only goal. Though try telling that to a sponsor, they have difficulty.
I don't like it.
Yeah, they don't want to lose power. So I think it's a debate, and you have to make judgments in designing your trial as to, but not have deaths at the top of the hierarchy would seem very strange.
Yeah.
And you can see the example in the DELIVER trial, where there was a dilution in power correctly by recognizing that the deaths do matter in a quality of life analysis, because it's the worst possible outcome, and therefore diluting the result was appropriate. Yeah.
I have other questions, but it looks like there's others, so I think we'll let Henry go ahead, and I'll come back.
Okay.
Henry, do you want to speak up? Ask your question.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I was just wondering if the win ratio analysis is already implemented in any R package yet.
We have software available in SAS and in Stata, which people can use. I'm not a software sort of person, so what you need to do is email me, and my colleague John Gregson, who is like my whiz kid on the software, will inform you how it's going. A few years ago, my answer would have been rather negative, but now it's catching up fast on the software side. But I'm not the expert to answer that particular question, other than to fluff my lines as I'm doing right now.
Okay, thank you.
You need software at two levels. You need software for doing the analysis, and you also need software for the trial design and the power calculations at the beginning. So both are available.
Questions?
Could you comment on the you'd commented before, when you have two outcomes based really on the same construct, like heart failure, there was time to heart failure, and then there was the number of heart failure episodes. Is that conceptually a little bit problematic, because it's kind of the same type of outcome, and you're looking at it in different ways, and I wasn't sure if that made sense up front to include it in a hierarchy.
Yeah, I think I implied in my middle of my impulse example that it probably didn't make much sense, but we shouldn't blame the innovators, the impulse trial designers. I didn't help design it, I came in later, for pioneering what to do. I think it is a bit of a strange construct, because if you untie based on the number of hospitalizations, then it means the next level, you're looking at patients who had the same number of events. And does it really matter on the order of events? If they both had the same number, does it really matter which one happened first? Probably not, really. So I think it's best either to untie on the basis of time to first event, or the number of events on the shared follow-up time. But it would be interesting maybe to look at other examples with longer follow-up to see, because that particular example is rather short-term follow-up, to see what matters. And then you have to choose which. Are you better untying on the number of events or on the time to first event?
Yeah.
And it would be nice to sort out which of those works better, particularly when you have longer follow-up. And so there's some I've got ideas, but there's still unanswered questions on that topic, I think.
And could we use this methodology for observational studies where there are competing risks? So you're looking at some kind of a prognosticator with this, or is this in the trial domain?
Well, I've come across its intended use in observational studies of treatment, so you could call them non-randomized trials or real-world evidence. So there's nothing against real-world evidence, applying this to real-world evidence studies. if you're not looking at treatment, but other sorts of observational outcomes, it would need to be a binary prognostic indicator of some sort. Because at the moment, at least the methodology as it exists now, and though I think in that scenario, there's no reason why not to go ahead and use it. As long as it makes sense. It's got to make sense to you, not just to the statistician playing with his numbers. So yes.
Perfect. I think Michael Kramer has a comment. So I'm gonna stop.
Michael, do you want to say something? I don't.
No, I didn't really want to say anything. I just thought it was a great presentation, and each time I wanted to ask a question, it was already answered. So thank you for anybody who was involved in planning this, and to Professor Pocock for doing it. It's great.
My pleasure.
Yeah, Kabiri was the one who had the idea to invite Dr. Pocock. Thomas, you have a question? Yes.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. Which is your approach when you have a hard outcome that does not happen very often and a surrogate outcome lower in your hierarchical analysis that shows strong benefit? It's a common problem in nephrology. We see good signal with surrogate outcomes, but we don't see much difference in hard outcomes.
Well, yes, that's true. Is that because there is no signal in the hard outcomes, or because you don't have enough of them to get evidence? Sometimes the hard outcomes, so it's hard to do big enough studies to be powered for the hard outcomes. So I'm just putting the question back to you. Is it because you have insufficient evidence, or it really doesn't work in the hard outcomes?
Could be a combination of both, depending on the question. But if you are seeing things in opposite direction, for example, there was a trial with Entresto that showed a better slope decline in kidney function, but worse albuminuria. So these were contradictory. The surrogate outcome was suggesting harm, but not that hard outcome, but still the clinical outcome was suggesting benefit. How do you resolve this in your win analysis?
I think the flippant answer is with difficulty. I think if you have the win ratio type, I mean, it's a method. And it's also a little bit of a fashion right now in cardiovascular trialists. It may reach nephrology soon. And therefore you need to be cautious about, does it really fit what I'm trying to study in my particular condition I want to study? And if you find it's best suited when the components of the outcomes are liable to go in the same direction. So the hard outcomes are harder to study because there are fewer of them. But if they were to go in the opposite direction to the surrogate outcomes, then I don't think a win ratio analysis is really appropriate in that setting, because you're combining contradictory items. So I think you then need to study why that's happening. Why is it that the surrogates were not surrogates after all? They were just biomarkers, and they were perhaps a misleading optimism when in fact the hard outcomes could not be affected. Unless the surrogate is a benefit to the patient. I mean, if it's quality of life, then that's a benefit to the patient directly. So, but if it's just a biomarker, then the patient doesn't feel that, and therefore you can argue, well, what's the good of that if it doesn't affect the... So you're taking us into a deeper discussion beyond win ratio, which will be interesting, but perhaps beyond the scope of what I'm about today. So,
thank you very much.
I have a question, and it's a statistician type question. And then when you describe this statistic as being defined based on the number of pairs of subjects. I just wonder, how it reminds me of the area under the ROC curve. So is it similar? Or the Wilcoxon-Ransom statistic?
The second, it's rather similar to the two-sample Wilcoxon test. You can thinking of it as a rank statistic, because what you're a non-parametric statistic, because if everyone was followed for the same period of time, and most of these trials that's not true, but suppose they were all followed for the same period of time and nobody was lost to follow-up, then you rank patients from the worst possible outcome, which is the one who died first. And if quality of life was at the bottom of the hierarchy, then it would be the best possible outcome is the patient who had none of those nasty events and had a super improvement in quality of life. So essentially, you can think of the win ratio is like a ranking from best to worst. And then you do the paired comparisons all the way along. And you could have, in that setting, if you had perfectly complete data, it does boil down to essentially a two-sample Wilcoxon test. But then life is never that simple, because you have patients lost to follow-up, you have varying follow-up, and or missing data, and therefore the win ratio takes those things into account more easily. Right. But it is like one way of simplifying it is to think of it as a rank statistic.
Thank you very much.
But nothing to do with an ROC curve as far as I can work out. So that's another mess.
In fact, Jim Hanley is not here. I just found out he's away on vacation. That's why he's not here.
Yeah, I saw that somebody in the chat said that. Yeah.
And I think one of his landmark papers was to show that the area under the curve, under the ROC curve, is a function of the Wilcoxon-Ransom statistic. So
right.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah.
But that is, it's always a probability, whereas here you're defining a ratio because you've got two groups that are being compared. And as you say, indeed, it's a lot more complicated because this is longitudinal data with all sorts of peculiarities.
I understand now. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Pocock. I think you inspired all of us with this excellent presentation. With your style of presentation.
And 5 o'clock is an excellent time for me to give a seminar. So thank you. Good timing. Thank you.